In the biting cold of November 1981, the three Miller triplets vanished from a remote cabin in Blackwood Forest. Sam, Leo, and Noah, all just shy of their first birthday, were gone without a trace. Their disappearance became a wound in the heart of the community, a story that morphed into a chilling local legend. For 30 long years, the case file gathered dust, a monument to a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. A perfect crime swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness. The official story was a tragic accident. The truth, however, was something far more sinister, buried under decades of lies and corruption. 30 years later, a single phone call from a dying woman hundreds of miles away would shatter the silence. It was a catalyst that would unravel a conspiracy of breathtaking cruelty and lead a mother, who never gave up hope, to a horrible discovery that would change not only her life, but the very definition of justice. What she was about to learn was that her sons hadn't been lost to the forest. They had been stolen by monsters who wore human faces. The world that was shattered that night was one of incandescent joy, centered entirely around Sarah Miller. Before the triplets, Sarah had been an artist, her canvases filled with vibrant landscapes and hopeful abstracts. But with the arrival of Sam, Leo, and Noah, her art found a new, living medium. Her life became a masterpiece of controlled, happy chaos. Sarah was a woman of immense patience and a quiet, observant nature. She could distinguish her identical sons not by a colored bracelet, but by the unique music of their babbling. Sam was the stoic observer, his dark eyes taking in everything with a solemn gravity. Leo was the adventurer, the first to crawl, the first to pull himself up, his face a constant mask of determined curiosity. And Noah was the smiler, the giggler, the little diplomat who could soothe any squabble with a gurgle and a gummy grin. Their father, Mark, was a brilliant architect, a man driven by ambition and a desire to build a perfect life for his new family. He was often consumed by work, sketching blueprints late into the night, but his love for his sons was fierce and undeniable. He was the mountain to Sarah's meadow, strong and protective. Their home in the suburbs was a symphony of baby noises, the scent of formula, and the soft light of a nursery. Sarah's days were a routine she cherished. The synchronized morning feedings, the logistical ballet of a triple stroller walk through the park, the delightful mess of bath time where 3 tiny bodies splashed and shrieked with glee. She kept a detailed baby book for each boy, pasting in snippets of hair from their first haircuts and documenting milestones with a loving precision. "Leo took his first step today," she wrote. "He wobbled like a tiny sailor and fell right into Sam's lap, making them both laugh." These weren't just records. They were testaments to a life bursting with love. She had dreams for them, little futures she'd imagine as she rocked them to sleep. She saw Sam becoming a thoughtful professor, Leo an intrepid explorer, and Noah a charismatic leader who could charm the world. Her own ambitions to paint were on hold, but it felt like a worthy sacrifice. This was her great work now. Her friends marveled at her stamina, her seemingly endless well of energy. But it wasn't stamina, it was love. The emotional stakes were everything she was. Her identity had seamlessly merged with her role as their mother. They were her purpose, her present, and her future. There was a particular memory she would cling to in the dark years to come. It was a simple Tuesday afternoon. All 3 boys were in their playpen, and for a rare moment, they were quiet. She watched as Leo, holding a red block, passed it to Noah. Noah took it, babbled something, and passed it to Sam. Sam studied it for a moment, then passed it back to Leo. They continued this silent, perfect circle for almost a minute. It was a moment of pure, unspoken connection between them, a secret language only they understood. In that simple exchange of a block, Sarah saw the entirety of their bond. It was a bond she believed was unbreakable, forged in the womb and meant to last a lifetime. This was the life that was stolen. Not just 3 children, but the entire universe they had created. It was a world of first steps, of shared laughter, of a mother's complete and unconditional love. The silence that would soon descend would not just be the absence of noise, but the absence of this entire, vibrant existence. The decision that set the tragedy in motion was born of celebration. Mark had just landed the biggest contract of his career, a sprawling city development project that would secure their family's future and cement his legacy. He burst through the door, his face flushed with triumph, waving the signed papers like a victory flag. He wanted to do something memorable, something spontaneous to mark the occasion. He proposed a weekend trip to a secluded cabin his company owned deep in Blackwood Forest, a rustic retreat used for corporate getaways. Sarah was hesitant. It was already mid-November, and the weather reports were turning sour, whispering of an early winter storm. The boys were so young, and the cabin was 2 hours from the nearest town. But Mark was insistent, painting a picture of a crackling fire, crisp mountain air, and a well-deserved escape from the city. His infectious excitement eventually won her over. They packed in a flurry, a chaotic jumble of diapers, formula, winter clothes, and toys. The drive up was beautiful, the autumn leaves giving way to the stark, powerful beauty of the evergreen forest. Yet, as they climbed higher into the mountains, the sky began to take on a bruised, heavy look. An unspoken tension settled in the car. They arrived at the cabin as the first flurries of snow began to fall. It was a handsome log structure, but isolated, with no other homes visible for miles. The caretaker, a wiry old man named Silas with a sour disposition and eyes that didn't quite meet theirs, handed them the key. "Storm's coming in fast," he grunted, looking at the triplets in their car seats with an expression that wasn't friendly. "Not a good night to be up here, phone lines get unreliable." He lingered for a moment too long, his gaze falling on the expensive leather briefcase Mark always carried, the one containing his new contract. Then, he shuffled off into the thickening snow without another word. Inside, the cabin was cold. While Mark wrestled with the fireplace, Sarah set up the portable cribs in a small, wood-paneled room that would serve as the nursery. She fed the boys, changed them, and swaddled them in thick blankets, humming a lullaby as their eyes grew heavy. The wind was beginning to howl outside, rattling the window panes. By the time the triplets were asleep, a full-blown blizzard was raging. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the frantic light of the fire Mark had finally managed to start. The celebration felt hollow now, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Sarah and Mark sat in near silence, the storm outside a mirror of the one brewing between them. Sarah voiced her fears, the "I told you so" hanging unspoken in the air. Mark, defensive and stressed, accused her of being pessimistic. It was a stupid, tired argument, fueled by anxiety and the isolation of their surroundings. "I just want what's best for them, Mark," she said, her voice small against the roar of the wind. "I know," he replied, his anger deflating into exhaustion. "I do too." They made a fragile peace, huddling together under a blanket, promising to leave at first light. Mark eventually drifted off to sleep on the sofa, still fully clothed, the fire casting dancing shadows on his weary face. Sarah, however, couldn't rest. She checked on the boys one last time, their chests rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. She gently pushed the nursery door, leaving it slightly ajar so she could hear them. The last thing she noticed before exhaustion finally claimed her was the violent shudder of the nursery window, as a particularly strong gust of wind slammed against it. It was a fatal observation that would haunt her for the rest of her life, a seemingly insignificant detail that was, in fact, the beginning of the end. The cold was the first thing to register, a deep, biting chill that had crept into the very bones of the cabin. Sarah stirred on the armchair, a stiff crick in her neck. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the blizzard outside had settled into a relentless heavy snowfall. A profound and unnatural silence had fallen over the cabin. It was the silence that jolted her fully awake. No crying, no fussing, no soft baby snores drifting from the nursery. A spike of pure, cold adrenaline shot through her. "Mark," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. He mumbled, still lost in sleep on the sofa. "Mark, wake up!" She didn't wait for him. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the nursery, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. The door was ajar, just as she'd left it. But the room was different. The cold was emanating from here. The window, the one that had been rattling in the storm, was now wide open, a curtain of fine snow dusting the floor beneath it. And the 3 cribs were empty. The blankets were thrown back, but neatly, not as if a child had struggled. It was as if they had simply been lifted out. No, she breathed. The word a small, broken sound. Her mind refused to process it. She checked under the cribs, in the small closet, her movements becoming more frantic. They weren't there. "Mark!" she shrieked, a raw, primal sound of terror. "Mark, they're gone!" Mark stumbled into the room, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into horror as he took in the scene. The empty cribs, the open window, the snow on the floor. "What do you mean, gone?" he stammered, his voice thick with sleep and disbelief. "They can't be gone." They tore the small cabin apart. Every closet, every cupboard, under the beds, behind the sofa. Nothing. Their search grew more desperate, their calls for Sam, Leo, Noah, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Panic was a living entity in the room, choking the air, making it hard to breathe. Mark, in a fit of desperate rage, punched the wall. Sarah crumpled to the floor of the nursery, her body racked with sobs that made no sound. Her eyes scanned the room one more time, searching for any detail, any clue her panicked mind had missed. And then she saw it. Lying half-hidden under the leg of Sam's crib was an object that did not belong. It was a small, hand-carved wooden toy soldier, painted with crude, faded colors. It wasn't one of theirs. They had never seen it before. It was a chilling, alien presence in the heart of their sanctuary. Mark grabbed the phone. The line was dead. The storm had cut them off completely. They were trapped, alone with their mounting terror. At the first hint of dawn, they bundled up and fought their way through waist-deep snow to their car. It wouldn't start. The engine was frozen solid. Their only hope was to walk, to try and reach the main road miles away. Hours later, a snowplow driver found them, half frozen and barely coherent, stumbling along the side of the road. He rushed them to the nearest town, where Sarah, shivering uncontrollably in the local sheriff's office, made the call that would officially begin the nightmare. The 911 dispatcher's recording would later be played for juries and news reporters, a chilling artifact of a mother's agony. 911, what is your emergency? My babies are gone. Sarah's voice was a hoarse, broken whisper. Ma'am, please calm down, where are you? The cabin, Blackwood Forest, and we were at the cabin. Okay, ma'am, tell me what happened. They're gone. I woke up and they were gone. The window was open and there's a toy. It's not our toy. Her voice dissolved into raw, incoherent grief. The dispatcher tried to keep her on the line, but all that could be heard was the sound of a soul fracturing, the horrifying moment when a mother's world ceased to exist. The search was about to begin, but the truth was it was already too late. The official response, when it came, was massive and immediate. The story of 3 missing infants, vanished from a remote cabin during a blizzard, was a nightmare scenario that galvanized the entire region. Sheriff Brody, a man with a weathered face and a reputation for being a no-nonsense local lawman, took personal command of the operation. He established a command post at the base of the mountain, a chaotic hub of activity humming with the grim energy of a military campaign. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers bundled in orange and yellow had arrived, ready to brave the elements. They were joined by state police, experienced search and rescue teams, and canine units. The scene was set for a heroic effort against the odds. But the mountain was merciless. The blizzard that had provided the cover for the disappearance now became the investigation's greatest enemy. It had dumped nearly 4 feet of snow on the forest, a thick, pristine blanket that concealed everything. Any tracks, any sign of passage, had been completely erased. The search dogs, some of the best in the state, were brought to the cabin. They circled frantically, catching a faint scent near the open nursery window, but it vanished almost instantly at the edge of the woods, lost in the swirling snow and biting wind. It was as if the children had simply been lifted into the air and carried away. The search teams formed long lines, painstakingly wading through the deep snow, using long poles to probe every drift, every hollow, every space beneath the low-hanging boughs of the fir trees. The work was exhausting and demoralizing. The cold was brutal, and the forest, silent and white, offered up no clues. It simply swallowed their efforts. Sheriff Brody, under immense pressure from the media that had descended on the small town, made a series of critical and ultimately fatal decisions. Based on the open window and the impossibility of a vehicle reaching the cabin in the storm, he fixated on the theory that the triplets had somehow, impossibly, wandered out on their own and succumbed to the elements. This led him to discount the possibility of abduction, a crucial error in judgment. Instead of sealing the cabin as a primary crime scene, it was treated as a starting point for the search, with dozens of people tramping in and out, potentially contaminating what little evidence might have existed. His focus also turned, with a chilling intensity, on Sarah and Mark. He subjected them to hours of grueling interrogation, his questions sharp with suspicion. Why did you come up here in a storm? Did you argue? Were the babies a strain on your marriage? He probed their grief for inconsistencies, seeing potential guilt where there was only devastation. Precious hours, and then days, were wasted pursuing a narrative of parental negligence or involvement, while the real trail, if one ever existed, grew colder than the frozen ground. The search was further cursed by tragedy. On the third day, a search helicopter, battling treacherous updrafts near the mountain's peak, lost control. The pilot fought bravely, but the rotor clipped a snow-laden tree, and the aircraft spiraled downward, crashing into a ravine. The pilot, a veteran of countless rescue missions, was killed instantly. A dark pall fell over the entire operation. The search for 3 lost babies had now claimed another life. It felt as if the mountain itself was hostile, actively resisting their efforts. After a week of relentless but fruitless searching, with the weather showing no signs of improving, the decision was made. Sheriff Brody called a press conference, his face grim. He announced that the official ground search was being suspended indefinitely. "We've done everything humanly possible," he said, his voice heavy with feigned solemnity. "Every resource has been deployed. It is with a heavy heart that we must conclude this has become a recovery mission, not a rescue. We believe the children wandered from the cabin and were tragically overcome by the severe weather. Their bodies are likely buried deep beneath the snow, and we may not find them until the spring thaw." For the media, it was a tragic but closed chapter. For Sarah and Mark, it was a betrayal. They knew their babies hadn't wandered out. They knew something else had happened, but no one was listening. The failure of the search was absolute. It wasn't just that they hadn't found the boys. It was that the official investigation had cemented a false narrative, closing the door on any other possibility and burying the truth under an avalanche of incompetence and misdirection. The spring thaw came, but it offered no answers. The snow melted, revealing the forest floor, but the children were not there. The case of the Miller triplets went cold, frozen in time like a macabre photograph. The years that followed were a long, slow erosion of hope, a relentless grinding down of the human spirit. For Sarah and Mark, the shared trauma that should have bound them together instead became a chasm that ripped them apart. The cabin in Blackwood Forest was a ghost that haunted their marriage. Mark, consumed by a toxic cocktail of guilt and grief, threw himself into his work with a manic desperation, a transparent attempt to outrun his own demons. He couldn't look at Sarah without seeing the accusation in her eyes, the same accusation he leveled against himself every waking moment. It was his idea to go to the cabin, his celebration, his failure to protect them. The silence in their once noisy house was a physical presence, thick with unspoken blame and sorrow. They were 2 people drowning in the same ocean, but too lost in their own pain to reach for each other. They divorced 2 years after the disappearance. Mark moved across the country, severing ties with the place that had destroyed him. He sent Sarah money every month, a guilt-ridden penance, but they rarely spoke. Sarah stayed. Leaving felt like abandoning her sons all over again. She remained in the same house, keeping the nursery exactly as it had been, a pristine, heartbreaking museum of a life that had ended before it began. She became a familiar, spectral figure in the town, the mother of the lost triplets, a title she wore with a quiet, devastating dignity. She worked part-time at the local library, the silence of the stacks a comfort. But every year on their birthday, November 18th, she would perform a solemn ritual. She would drive to the edge of Blackwood Forest, walk to a small clearing that overlooked the mountains, and leave 3 small bouquets of flowers. It was a pilgrimage of pain, a mother's refusal to forget. In the community, the story of the Blackwood triplets curdled into folklore. It became a ghost story told around campfires, a cautionary tale for misbehaving children. Don't wander into the woods, or the spirit of the mountain will take you, just like it took those babies. The cabin itself was abandoned, falling into disrepair. Teenagers would dare each other to spend a night there, claiming to hear the phantom cries of infants on the wind. The tragedy had become a piece of local color, its raw human pain smoothed over by time and myth. The official case file was relegated to a dusty box in the archives of the county sheriff's department, labeled Miller, Samuel, Leo, Noah, unsolved, presumed deceased. For investigators who came and went over the years, it was a tragic but closed book, a case of parental oversight meeting the unforgiving force of nature. There were no leads, no evidence, no reason to ever look again. For 29 years, this was the reality, a state of perpetual, agonizing unknowing. The hope that had once burned so brightly in Sarah's heart had dwindled to a tiny, stubborn ember, shielded against a relentless wind of despair. She was no longer waiting for a rescue. She was simply enduring the silence, the long, cold years of a mystery that the world had accepted as unsolvable. The ripple effects of that one night had spread outwards, devastating a family, haunting a town, and burying a horrific crime under the weight of a simple, tragic lie. The shift began not with a bang, but with a whisper. In a sterile, quiet hospice room in Phoenix, Arizona, a world away from the cold shadows of Blackwood Forest, an elderly woman named Eleanor Vance was nearing the end of her life. For 3 decades, she had carried a secret that had poisoned her soul, a secret that now, in the face of her own mortality, had become too heavy to bear. Eleanor had been a registered nurse, and her conscience, prodded by a hospice chaplain, finally cracked. She made a call, not to the police but to a national hotline for missing persons, her voice weak and trembling. She wouldn't give her name, but she unburdened herself of a story that sounded like a fever dream. It was 1981, she rasped. November. I was working at a small private clinic outside of Flagstaff. It's long gone now. There was a terrible storm that night. The hotline operator listened, transcribing every word. A man came in, Eleanor continued, her breathing labored. He was a lawman, a sheriff or a deputy. I remember the uniform. He wasn't alone. He had 3 babies with him, identical baby boys. The operator's fingers froze on the keyboard. Eleanor's confession spilled out in a fragmented torrent. The babies weren't sick or injured. They were sleeping, maybe drugged. The sheriff handed them, along with a suitcase full of cash, to a well-dressed couple who were waiting. Eleanor and the clinic's doctor were paid an exorbitant amount of money to create 3 new birth certificates, to give the children new names and new identities, and to forget what they saw. I never knew the sheriff's name. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound. But I remember he had a scar, a little white line right here. Her shaky finger pointed to the space just above her right eyebrow. He said their parents were dead. A car accident. But I knew he was lying. Days later, Eleanor passed away. Her anonymous tip, flagged for its unusual and specific details, was entered into a national database where it sat for months, one of thousands of unverified leads. It might have stayed there forever, a digital ghost, had it not been for the dogged persistence of a young, ambitious detective in the cold case unit of the state police. Detective Isabella Rossi was assigned to clear a backlog of low-priority tips. She was methodical, thorough, and possessed an innate skepticism of official narratives. The Blackwood Triplets case was technically out of her jurisdiction, a county matter, but the tip had been logged in her state system. The details, 3 identical boys, November 1981, a blizzard, were too specific to ignore. Rossi felt a prickle of instinct. She pulled the original case file, a thick, musty folder filled with faded reports and grainy photographs. She spent a week poring over every document, the witness statements, the search grid maps, the autopsy report for the helicopter pilot. She read Sheriff Brody's final report, his confident assertion that the children had wandered off. It felt too neat, too simple. Then she got to the crime scene photographs. She flipped through pictures of the cabin, the snow-filled woods, and then the personnel. She stopped at a photo of Sheriff Brody, looking young and authoritative, directing the search. She zoomed in on his face, and there it was, a faint but unmistakable white line cutting through his right eyebrow. A scar. A shiver went down Rossi's spine. It was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, a whisper from a dead woman 1,000 miles away. But suddenly, the coldest case on the books had a flicker of heat. The narrative that had stood for 30 years began to tremble, and a small crack appeared in the wall of lies. Detective Rossi knew she was standing at the precipice of something enormous. The long, hopeless winter of the Miller case was about to end. Detective Isabella Rossi knew that accusing a decorated retired sheriff of a 30-year-old crime based on a dead woman's anonymous tip was career suicide unless she had irrefutable proof. She began to dig, not with a shovel but with the quiet, relentless tools of a modern investigator. She started with Sheriff Brody's financials. Working with a forensic accountant, she discovered a glaring anomaly. In the spring of 1982, just a few months after the search for the triplets was called off, Brody, a man on a modest public servant's salary, made a series of large, untraceable cash deposits into a new bank account. It was enough to buy a new house and put his kids through college. The official record showed he claimed it was an inheritance from a distant aunt. Rossi checked. The aunt had died penniless. The first lie was exposed. Next, Rossi went looking for the surly caretaker, Silas. She found him living in a dilapidated trailer park, a bitter, reclusive old man haunted by his past. At first, he was hostile, threatening to call the police on the police. But Rossi was not Sheriff Brody. She was patient, empathetic, yet unyielding. She didn't accuse him. She spoke to him about conscience, about the weight of carrying a secret for 30 years. She told him about the mother who still left flowers in the woods. After 2 days of visits, Silas broke. Through tears of shame, he confessed his role. "Brody paid me," he rasped, his voice thin as paper. $500. A fortune to me then. He told me to loosen the latch on the nursery window before the family got there. And later, he told me to tell the search parties I'd seen the kids' tracks heading towards the old ravine. It was a lie. I never saw a thing. He sent them all in the wrong direction on purpose. The conspiracy was no longer a theory. It was a fact. Rossi now had a corrupt sheriff and a deliberate misdirection of the investigation, but the motive was still missing. Why? Why would a sheriff orchestrate such a thing? The answer, she suspected, wasn't in the woods, but in the life the Millers had left behind. She delved into Mark Miller's professional life in 1981, specifically the massive architectural contract that had prompted the celebratory trip. The runner-up for that lucrative city project was a company owned by a notoriously ruthless real estate magnate named Alistair Finch. Finch was a man with a reputation for corporate savagery and a pathological hatred of losing. He was known for destroying his competitors, not just financially but personally. Rossi started pulling Finch's financial records from the era. It was a tangled web of shell corporations and offshore accounts, but she found what she was looking for: a series of payments from a Finch-owned holding company to a private account belonging to Sheriff Brody's wife, disguised as consulting fees. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. This wasn't random. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a hit, a meticulously planned, soul-crushingly cruel act of revenge orchestrated by Finch and executed by a compromised lawman. Finch hadn't wanted to ruin Mark Miller's career. He wanted to obliterate his life, to sentence him to a lifetime of torment. With federal warrants in hand, Rossi coordinated a multi-state operation. One team descended on the quiet retirement community of former Sheriff Brody. The man who had once been the face of the law crumpled instantly, his tough guy facade dissolving into a pathetic, weeping mess as the cuffs were snapped on his wrists. The main team, led by Rossi herself, raided the sprawling, opulent estate of the now 85-year-old Alistair Finch. Finch was arrogant and dismissive, threatening them with his army of lawyers. But Rossi had a warrant for his private study. Tucked away in a hidden safe behind a false wall, they found it. Decades of a secret life, documented with the chilling precision of a psychopath. There were ledgers, photographs, and files, and among them, a folder labeled Miller. Inside were 3 forged adoption certificates for 3 different male infants, all processed through the now-defunct Arizona clinic. The boys had been placed with 3 separate, wealthy, childless families, all of whom had deep business ties to Alistair Finch. It was all there. The what was answered. The triplets had been sedated, abducted by the sheriff sworn to protect them, driven through a blizzard, and sold like property, all to settle a business score. The confrontation with Finch was chilling. Even with the evidence laid out before him, he showed no remorse. Miller was an insect, he sneered at Rossi from across the interrogation table. He needed to be taught that some men are not to be trifled with. I gave those boys a better life than he ever could have. I gave them wealth, privilege. In a way, I did them a favor. Rossi stared into the face of pure, unadulterated evil. You didn't give them a better life, she said, her voice cold as steel. You stole one, and now you're going to pay for it. The 30-year-old mystery was over. The truth was out, and it was more horrible than anyone could have ever imagined. The revelation sent shockwaves through the country. The story of the stolen Blackwood triplets became a media firestorm, a chilling saga of greed, revenge, and corruption. In the aftermath of the arrests, the full scope of the conspiracy was laid bare for a horrified public to see. Alistair Finch, the architect of the crime, and former Sheriff Brody, his willing instrument, were charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, and a host of other felonies. The case against them was overwhelming. Silas, the caretaker, became the state's star witness. The financial records were irrefutable, and the files from Finch's safe were the nail in the coffin. The why, when it was fully explained, was almost as shocking as the crime itself. Alistair Finch was a man who defined himself by his absolute power and his ability to win at any cost. Mark Miller's victory in securing the city development contract was more than a financial loss to Finch. It was a deep, personal humiliation. In Finch's warped worldview, Mark had not simply outbid him, he had disrespected him. Finch decided on a punishment that would be biblical in its cruelty. He learned through his network that Mark Miller's greatest source of pride and joy was not his career, but his 3 infant sons. So Finch decided to take them. He didn't want them dead. Death would have brought a form of closure. He wanted Mark and Sarah to live every day for the rest of their lives in the agonizing abyss of the unknown. He wanted to inflict a wound that could never heal. He activated his network and found the perfect tool, Sheriff Brody. Brody was in deep, desperate trouble. He had crippling gambling debts owed to loan sharks with connections to organized crime. Finch offered him a lifeline, a sum of money that would not only clear his debts, but set him up for life. All he had to do was steal 3 children. Brody, seeing a way out of his own personal hell, agreed to create one for the Miller family. The plan was executed with cold precision. Brody used his authority to gain information, learning of the Millers' spontaneous trip. He paid Silas to compromise the cabin's security and to later misdirect the search. He used the blizzard, a stroke of luck, as the perfect natural cover. On that terrible night, while the Millers slept, exhausted from their journey and the argument, Brody slipped into the nursery. He administered a mild sedative to the infants to keep them from crying, lifted them from their cribs, and carried them out into the storm to a waiting vehicle. He drove them through the night to the prearranged clinic in Arizona, a facility that had done illicit work for Finch's associates in the past. There, he handed the babies over, collected his payment, and drove back, arriving in time to take charge of the investigation into their disappearance. The 3 boys were separated immediately. They were given new names, new birthdays, and new lives. Each was placed with a different family within Finch's sphere of influence. Families who were told the infants were the orphaned children of a distant business associate, with all the paperwork legally airtight, thanks to Finch's corrupt connections. The system designed to protect children was perverted to traffic them, and the system designed to find them was corrupted to hide them. For 30 years, the lie held, a testament to the terrifying power that wealth and influence can wield. The most difficult phone call of Detective Rossi's career was the one she made to Sarah Miller. She asked to meet in person. Sitting in the same quiet living room that had been frozen in time for 3 decades, Rossi gently, carefully, walked Sarah through the truth. She told her about Brody, about Finch, about the revenge plot. And then, she delivered the words Sarah had prayed to hear for 10,150 days. "Sarah," Rossi said, her voice soft, "they're alive. We found them. All 3 of them. They're alive." The world stopped. For a long moment, Sarah didn't react. She simply stared at Rossi, her mind unable to bridge the 30-year gap between hope and reality. Then a sound escaped her, a low, guttural sob that was equal parts agony and ecstasy. The dam of grief she had maintained for a lifetime finally broke, and she wept, not just for the sorrow of the past, but for the impossible joy of the present. The news was delivered to the three men separately. Daniel, a successful software engineer in California; James, a high school history teacher in Oregon; Michael, a landscape architect in Colorado. All now 31 years old. They had grown up in loving, privileged homes, always knowing they were adopted, but the stories they'd been told were lies. The revelation that they were not orphans, but victims of a kidnapping, and that they were triplets, was a seismic shock that upended their entire identities. The reunion was arranged to be private, away from the glare of the media. In a quiet hotel conference room, the three men walked in, one by one. Three strangers with the same face, the same eyes, the same mannerisms. They stared at each other in stunned silence, seeing their own reflection in two other people. The connection was instant, a strange, primal recognition that transcended a lifetime of separation. Then, the door opened, and Sarah walked in. She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from one face to the next, her eyes drinking in the men her babies had become. Daniel had Sam's solemn eyes, James had Leo's curious tilt of the head, and Michael had Noah's easy, warm smile. "My boys," she whispered, the words she had longed to say for 30 years. They came together in the center of the room, a tangle of arms and tears. It was a moment of profound, breathtaking catharsis. There was joy, of course, an immense, overwhelming joy. But it was laced with the sharp, bitter pain of all the lost years. The first step she missed, the birthdays, the scraped knees, the graduations, a lifetime of memories that had been stolen from them all. Mark was also found. He was living a quiet, solitary life in another state, a man hollowed out by his past. When he was told the news, he collapsed. He flew in the next day, older, grayer, the vibrant ambition in his eyes long since extinguished. Seeing his sons, a reunion he never believed possible, was both a blessing and a torment. He saw in their faces the family he had lost, the husband and father he had failed to be. The family, so brutally torn apart, was now physically reunited. But the work of piecing together their fractured lives, of building a new future on the rubble of a stolen past, was just beginning. The case of the Miller triplets did not end with the guilty verdicts for Alistair Finch and Sheriff Brody. Its impact resonated far beyond the courtroom, becoming a catalyst for significant legal and social change. The story captured the nation's attention, not just as a true crime narrative, but as a profound parable about the depths of human evil and the extraordinary power of a mother's love. It exposed a terrifying vulnerability in the justice system, demonstrating how easily power and money could corrupt the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. In response to the public outcry, lawmakers were spurred into action. The case became the primary impetus for the passage of the Miller Act, a landmark piece of federal legislation. This new law eliminated the statute of limitations for kidnapping cases involving minors and dramatically increased the penalties for individuals, especially those in positions of authority, who conspire to conceal such crimes. It ensured that a crime as heinous as stealing a child could never again be hidden behind the simple passage of time. On a broader level, the case forced a national conversation about the handling of cold cases. It highlighted the critical importance of periodically re-examining old files with fresh eyes and new perspectives. Detective Rossi's approach, questioning the accepted narrative and leveraging modern data analysis, became a model for cold case units across the country. It underscored the idea that no case should ever be considered truly closed as long as questions remain. The legacy of the story, however, is most deeply felt in its human themes. It stands as an enduring testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Sarah Miller became a symbol of unwavering hope, a mother who refused to let the world declare her children gone, keeping a vigil in her heart for 3 decades. Her story offered a powerful counter-narrative to the cynicism of the modern age, a reminder that some bonds are forged so deeply they can withstand even the most malevolent of attacks. Conversely, Alistair Finch became an archetype of hubris and sociopathic greed, a modern-day monster whose cruelty served as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human heart. The story became a universal lesson that the greatest treasures in life, family, love, connection, are also the most vulnerable to the ambitions of those who have lost their souls to power. It is a legacy of both sorrow and hope, a chronicle of unimaginable loss and miraculous reunion. It teaches that while evil can inflict profound wounds, it cannot extinguish the light of a mother's love or the fundamental truth that was, for 30 long years, buried but never truly lost. The story of the Miller triplets is a chilling reminder that the most devastating monsters are not those that lurk in forests, but those who sit in positions of power, their evil hidden behind a veneer of respectability. It is a testament to an act of revenge so cruel it defies comprehension, yet it is also the ultimate story of a mother's love, a quiet, stubborn force that outlasted the conspiracy and ultimately conquered it. A family, torn apart by greed, was made whole again by the truth. If this incredible story of unbreakable family bonds and delayed justice moved you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to our channel for more true crime mysteries that defy belief. We want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what part of this unbelievable journey from despair to reunion shocked you the most.